my prize! The black car is mine! I don't see you! Prize is gone! There now! There now! No, no, no! Stick together! This is one clever fox!
One such man, one who had lost all, over and over, and to this, he had lost his sanity. His was a never-ending journey away from the phantoms of his past. He believed he could silence the cacophony in his mind and find peace beyond a place he called the Plains of Silence. He now had the vehicle, the weapons, the provisions and the fortitude. He only needed the fuel. And here, there was but one place to go for fuel. Gastown.
Listen, my apostles of Awful! You've hunted well. And here's the fox who thought he'd plunder from Scabra Scrotus.
Behold, child, you are risen from the dust, and you walk in my garden. Hear now my voice, and know that I am your maker, and I am called Elohim. Seek me in my temple, if you are worthy.
to be taking a look at a side-by-side comparison on medium settings here, and you'll notice that the Linux performance actually nearly rivals the Windows performance almost exactly. Now this is in contrast to my previous video where I was using the 361 drivers, which actually perform a lot worse. I had no idea at the time, but now that I've had time to test it myself, the 358 drivers perform admirably on Linux, and Feral have done actually a pretty good job, considering how this runs almost exactly like Windows on medium settings. In fact, there's some results after this that I'll show you that will be pretty interesting to see overall. This is not a frame-by-frame comparison, so I'm doing my best here to keep the scenes in sync and doing the same actions throughout, but you will notice that things aren't always exactly the same when the camera pans. So this is the best I can do since this game does not come with a benchmark mode. So we do see it drop slightly lower than the Windows side there just now. 39 frames per second was the lowest so far. Still admirable considering that there is translation going on behind the scenes. Overall, Feral have done a pretty good job actually. This is a really good job. I'm really surprised after seeing this myself. I was definitely expecting a lot worse. The 361 definitely performs a lot worse. The 358 drivers are definitely the go-to drivers if you're going to be playing this on Linux. So first up we have the minimal preset graph here, and you'll notice that the Ubuntu performance actually outdoes the Windows performance ever so slightly. And only in the medium preset do we see the 358 drivers go slightly less than the Windows driver. When we bring it up back to maximum after this, you'll see that once again the 358 drivers on Ubuntu surpass the Windows performance, and quite significantly, as I'll show you quickly in this side-by-side video up next, which I couldn't believe with my own eyes at first. The performance is significantly different. So on the left is Ubuntu and on the right is Windows, and to put it lightly, it's only playable on Ubuntu if I'm going to be running this at maximum. If I'm running it at maximum, it's just not usable at all on Windows. It's not even just in-game battles. Alright, we come to the juicy part, and that's the side-by-side comparison. We're starting off with DirectX 12 on Windows on the right and OpenGL 4 on Ubuntu. Considering that DirectX 12 is the flagship API of Windows right now compared to OpenGL 4, which is a rather dated API, we're only seeing about a 7 to 10 frames per second difference on average here, and that can likely be attributed to Feral's IndirectX layers overhead. So it would be interesting to see what they have for us next year when they bring in Vulkan. It's likely we can overcome DirectX 12 here. Now moving on to the default side, which is what most people will get on the Windows side when using DirectX 11, we do see a higher performance here, and we're seeing on average about 10 to 15 frames per second difference higher. So we're seeing about 10 to 15 frames per second more on Windows compared to the OpenGL side here, but that is to be expected. NVIDIA has a very strong DirectX 11 system of support here. So it's a little bit interesting to see that a past gen API runs better than a current gen API. So the graphs are pretty much showing what we saw in the side-by-side just now, with the Windows version generally leading overall by anywhere from 7 to 15 frames per second depending on the API. The frame times here do show that there is a slightly higher frame time on the Linux side, with anywhere from a single millisecond higher to about 4 milliseconds higher. So now we come to the juicy part, and that is the side-by-side comparison. So on the left is Ubuntu 16.04 and on the right is Windows 10. Both running at maxed out settings. Initially we do see Ubuntu is able to gain a slightly higher frames per second on average compared to the Windows version. But as we'll shortly see in a moment though, the tables do turn quite a bit due to, I believe, the Linux NVIDIA driver and Feral's IndirectX overhead. We'll see that the Windows version actually has the ability to go to a higher frame rate, as we're seeing now, up to 188 just now, while the Linux version I haven't been able to get past the 140, 150 range. That's the highest I've been able to get it to. Still, these are very solid numbers if we're remembering the past, like Shadow of Mordor. This is an improvement. Still, I'd love to see it at closer performance parity. Hopefully in the future with Vulkan we'll see that. Still, nonetheless, this is cool stuff to see right here. It makes me happy to see that we're getting this kind of quality performance. So as we've seen just now, the graphs will show us that we're getting a slightly less performance on average compared to the Windows version. The most notable thing to note here though is that the frame rate maximum is higher on the Windows version than it is on the Linux version, so something's happening there with the overhead. You'll also notice the minimum here on normal on Windows goes down really low. I'm not sure what's wrong with the normal settings on Windows. Every time I run it, it goes down really low and drops seriously. On 720p, we see a similar performance as the 1080p side when it's maxed out, so it's consistent. The performance seems to be linear across all settings and resolutions, except with normal settings. I'm not too sure what's wrong there. So as recommended by FastOS, we're going to be taking a quick look at test frame time here. And what this shows is two things. First is that the Linux version has the ability to have smoother frame rates with lower milliseconds per frame. However, when it dips so seriously you will feel it in comparison to the Windows version. If those dips were removed, the Linux version could be considered smoother than the Windows version. So now we come to the comparison part where I put them side by side. On the left side is Ubuntu 16.04 and on the right side is Windows 10. We're running this at ultra settings, everything on and maxed out at 1080p. And we see that Feral's port actually does pretty good at keeping up with the Windows side. We do, however, lose some frames, but the drops are consistent with what you get on Windows. That is, when Windows drops, we drop on Linux as well. But the drops can be ever so slightly more negative, anywhere ranging from only a few frames per second less to sometimes as high as 10 frames per second less. That said, this is at ultra, and considering that we have the IndirectX layer overhead, this is actually pretty well done. The outcome is not as bad as I thought it might be. Company of Heroes 2 had a slightly harder time keeping up. This is definitely an improvement. So as we saw just now, we're definitely losing slightly few more frames on Ubuntu than Windows on average. But as we see here from the outcome at the final part of the benchmark, is that we actually retain a higher minimum. And you can also see this on Gaming on Linux website as well with their benchmarks, which is actually a pretty good thing. This means when it drops, it doesn't drop as badly as it does on Windows. Now, an interesting thing is when we drop it down to 720p resolution, the Linux version actually overcomes the Windows version, and by quite a significant amount. So I've seen this in past benchmarks as well. It's a very interesting thing to see. I was also curious to see whether or not